Hello, welcome to the Encore presentation of the pilot episode of 19 Stories from Fear to Hope. It's hard to believe that 1 year ago I launched my podcast. Then again, the idea was birthed many years before with a different name but similar concept. It took a pandemic to move beyond my own fear to finally launch. Fear of what others would think, fear of looking like a beginner, which of course I was, and fear that I wouldn't be consistent with my own content. I wasn't. And yet I moved forward knowing that hearing people's stories was way more important than my fear. I knew that these stories would serve as a sort of audio journal of a time that we'd hopefully never see again in our lifetime. Now my hope moving forward is that I'm still able to share these stories as there are so many left untold. I also hope that this past year has allowed you to face some of your own fears, to move into the hope of your dreams, knowing how very precious and temporary our journey through this thing called life is. I want to thank all the guests who have joined me on the first year of my podcasting journey and so graciously shared their stories. As a celebration, I wanted to give a little something back to my listeners, so do stay tuned for the details. So without further ado, I present the Encore presentation of my pilot episode, which aired June 28th, 2020. I'm Cheryl Halling, and welcome to 19 Stories from Fear to Hope.
Disinformation is spreading.
There will be a surprise outbreak.
We only have
the
so many
issue
beds.
of pandemic.
No social distancing at all.
They said that they would express their concerns about the mask supply.
Where's the mask? Where's the glove?
One expert says
get away from all of these people.
We all need some good news.
A message for all the healthcare workers out there.
Thank you.
If you're looking for hope tonight, raise your hand. If you feel alone and don't understand, if you're fighting the fight of your life, then stand. We're gonna make it through this.
Thank you for joining me for the pilot of 19 Stories. I hope that you and your family are doing well during these times. I created 19 Stories as a vehicle to share great stories of people who are dealing with the fear induced by the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic and finding ways to overcome their fears and move into and hold onto hope. But do we really need a podcast about COVID-19, especially as we're starting to see our communities open up again? After all, there are numerous podcasts about COVID, covering such topics as how we got here, living with the virus, smart testing, daily updates on new fatalities and test numbers, and many more. While all of this information is important to be aware of, it can be incredibly fear-inducing, and that we are all facing in some form or another. However, in this pandemic, there have been moments of great joy, creativity, and innovations, and also a sense of hope. Hope that not only we will be able to survive this time, but also find new ways of living with a greater resolve to hold on to the people, things, and faith that mean the most to us. In listening to these stories, I've learned that it's not either fear or hope, but that the two can coexist. Perhaps we can be encouraged to know that what's meant to take us down will actually be the common thread that pulls us through. I would be remiss, however, if I didn't acknowledge the great sacrifice and loss of loved ones and livelihoods that our families and communities have experienced from this virus. My prayer is that each of these lives will be remembered, their families and friends be comforted, and communities restored. Now that you know the why of 19 Stories, I thought I would share a little bit of my story. I was born nearly 6 decades ago in Los Angeles after my parents, 2 siblings, and with me in the oven, moved from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, for my father to pursue a career in film and TV while continuing to direct theater. My folks met in the theater while my father was acting and directing, and my mother was singing and making costumes for a production they were in together. I'm sure their influence partially explains why I was inclined towards the creative arts. Although I had been in several of my father's productions, studied classical voice for a while, and was cast as a supernumerary, a fancy way of saying an extra, in a few of the operas my mother was in, I was a pretty awkward kid who found out that if I could make people laugh, then I could quell whatever fear and insecurities I was feeling, and also put others at ease as well. I did that by doing character voices and animal sounds. I had no idea where these voices and sounds came from, but I knew from an early age that what I wanted to be when I grew up was a singing cartoon. Although I have yet to actualize that dream, I have had the great pleasure of a diverse background in music promotion, entertainment, advertising, on camera, and voiceover work. My first job in radio began when I was 18 and worked through a work-study program at a relatively unknown NPR station in Santa Monica, KCRW, which has now become known nationally and internationally. In addition to working in the office during the day between classes at Santa Monica City College, I was given additional duties of being a board operator. That just meant that I ran the reel-to-reel tapes of the Santa Monica Symphony and monitoring the broadcasts of Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and Fresh Air before I went on to program and host my own music shows. Thankfully, my frequent nightmares of those reels flying off the player and unraveling during broadcast never came to pass. But I digress. It was during this time that I first heard Susan Stamberg co-hosting with Bob Edwards on All Things Considered, and the interviews and stories that were presented, and I was mesmerized. Here was a strong, confident, and funny woman on radio telling really interesting and intriguing stories on a format that presented the news of the day and yet had a very real human element that entertained and yet educated. Then I heard Terry Gross on Fresh Air, and I knew that somehow I wanted to take my love of Gab and talk to people about their stories. It's important to mention that all of these shows predated podcasts by a mere 40 years. I mentioned earlier that I will be 60 this year, and why I feel that's important is because both of my parents lived through the Great Depression and World War II. My father's side of the family was Jewish, and he and his two brothers fought against the Nazis as part of the Canadian Air Force, and I had a great cousin that survived the Holocaust. To say that these were devastating and challenging times is certainly an understatement, and yet my parents and the generation that survived these catastrophes had families, careers, moved on to other countries, and had full lives. And yet their lives and new beginnings were not without many challenges and sacrifices, and yes, fear as well. Although my father never spoke to me about the war until about 10 years prior to his passing in 2009 at the age of 92, it was all the other stories he told that allowed me to understand, relate to, and live a little into the fears, joys, and hope that he had experienced in his life. To a great extent that applied to my mother as well, given she left her family, country, and friends. I look forward to sharing these stories from men and women who are connected by their journey through fear, whether it be this invisible enemy called COVID or something else, and yet have found ways to be hopeful in the midst of facing it. I invite you to join me and listen into 19 Stories from Fear to Hope for as long as people want to share and tell them, and you as my listener want to hear them. I'd like to thank the following news outlets for the use of their clips in so aptly painting the picture of the fear that we're facing during this pandemic. BBC, PBS, Now This, UNESCO, and Some Good News. I especially want to thank Joel and Luke Smallbone, otherwise known as the Group for King and Country, for allowing me to use an excerpt of their song Together, which could not be a more hopeful and inspiring song for such a time as this. Finally, I'll leave you with the following from Proverbs 23:18. Surely there is a future, and your hope will not be cut off. Feel free to offer feedback or a story idea at 19stories@soundsatchelstudios.com. Visit my website at soundsatchelstudios.com, via Instagram at Cheryl Halling VO. I'll be back next week with episode 1 with my guest Jen Keefe. I hope you'll join me. Until then, stay healthy and hopeful.
Together with our differences, together we are bolder, braver, stronger.
Last but not least, if you'd like to be entered into a drawing, go to my website, soundsatchelstudios.com, click the podcast page, and submit an audio post of your review of this or any other episode that you may have enjoyed. I'll be entering your name into a contest to win one of 2 customized journals so that you can begin writing your own story. Once again, thank you so much for joining me today.